I used to think my husband's ambition was for us. It took me 3 years to realize his secret law school degree wasn't a tool to build our future, but a weapon he was forging to destroy mine. How could I have been so blind? For 15 years, I was Mark's wife. More than that, I was his partner, his biggest supporter, the one who managed the beautiful chaos of our home so he could climb his corporate ladder. I was the keeper of schedules, the healer of scraped knees, the steady hand that allowed him to be the star. I thought we were a team. While I was color-coding the family calendar and volunteering for the PTA, Mark was supposedly working late or attending mandatory leadership seminars. The truth was far more calculated. He wasn't crunching numbers for his firm. He was cramming for the bar exam. He was in law school. Our children, 8-year-old Liam and 6-year-old Chloe, were my entire world. They were our world, or so I believed. Mark was a good father, at least when he was physically present. But the man who came home, smelling of old paper and stale coffee, wasn't just tired from his finance job. It was the exhaustion of a double life. I'd rub the tension from his shoulders, telling him it would all be worth it. He'd just give me a thin, weary smile and say, "You have no idea." The questions started subtly, like a slow poison. He'd make comments about the glass of wine I'd have after the kids were in bed, framing it as concern for my stress. He began tracking my spending with an unnerving, spreadsheet level of detail. After I had a minor fender bender in the grocery store parking lot, he didn't ask if I was okay. He interrogated me, his questions cold and clinical, wanting to know exactly what I was doing in the moments leading up to the impact. I thought it was just his meticulous, anxious nature. I didn't realize I was being deposed, my fitness as a mother being quietly entered into evidence for a trial I didn't even know was coming. The breaking point wasn't a dramatic discovery. It was a Tuesday night. I was folding laundry on our bed, the scent of fresh linen, a small comfort, when Mark came in. He didn't drop his briefcase by the door like usual. He placed it on the dresser with a quiet, deliberate click. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said. His voice had the same flat, detached tone he'd used when he interrogated me about the car accident. My hand stilled over one of Liam's tiny superhero t-shirts. "Okay," I said, my heart starting a low, anxious drumbeat. He didn't sit, he stood over me, a judge before a defendant. "I've been unhappy for a long time," he began, the words rehearsed. "This marriage isn't working. I'm filing for divorce." The air left my lungs. Divorce. The word was a physical blow, but then came the part that shattered my reality. "And I'm filing for sole custody of the children." I looked up at him, my mind scrambling. "What? Mark, you can't be serious. Why?" A small, cruel smile touched his lips. "I am serious. I have a comprehensive file detailing your instability, your drinking, your financial irresponsibility, your negligence." He gestured vaguely toward the laundry pile, as if the very fabric of our home was evidence against me. He was twisting the life I had built for us into a weapon. My wine was alcoholism. My management of our finances was recklessness. My fender bender was a pattern of negligence that endangered our children. "This is insane," I whispered, shaking my head. "No judge would ever." "I won't have to convince a judge." He cut me off, his voice hardening with a new, terrifying authority. "I am the convincing argument. I passed the bar 6 months ago. That secret life you were so oblivious to, that was 3 years of law school. I'm an attorney now, Sarah, and I will be representing myself." There it was, the final, devastating truth. The law school wasn't a side project. It was the armory where he'd forged the weapons to dismantle my life and take my children. My children. Liam with his cowlick that wouldn't stay down, and Chloe, who still crawled into our bed after a nightmare. They were the center of my universe, the very reason I breathed. The thought of his cold, clinical hands being the only ones to tuck them in at night, of my role being reduced to a supervised visit every other weekend, a wave of pure, primal terror washed over me. It's a horrifying thing to realize the man you've loved for 15 years has been meticulously planning your destruction. If you're following my story and want to hear how I even began to pick myself up off the floor after that, Please like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next." He stood there, waiting for me to break, to cry, to scream, but all I could see were my children's faces, sleeping soundly in their beds down the hall, completely unaware that their father had just declared war on their mother. And in that moment, the fear began to curdle into something else, something hard and cold. He may have had his law school degree, but I had something he'd fatally underestimated. I was Liam and Chloe's mom. The battle was his idea, but I would be damned if I let him win. I held his gaze, the laundry forgotten in my lap. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He expected tears, pleading. He did not expect the flinty resolve that was solidifying in my gut. He didn't know the woman he was trying to break. "You won't win, Mark," I said, my voice low and steady, surprising even myself. "They are my children." His cruel smile returned, wider this time. "Oh, Sarah, you still think this is a fair fight?" He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, the one I'd picked out for him at Nordstrom for his last promotion. He pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of papers and tossed it onto the bed. It landed on Liam's superhero shirt with a soft thud. "That's a copy of the emergency motion I filed this afternoon, citing your recent erratic behavior and alcohol abuse. A judge has already signed a temporary order." My blood ran cold. A temporary order for what? "It freezes our joint assets," he said, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "All of them. The checking, the savings, the credit cards. I can't have my unstable wife liquidating the marital estate, can I? I have a fiduciary duty to the children." He used the legal terms like daggers, each one meant to wound and confuse me. A wave of nausea hit me. I scrambled for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling as I pulled up our banking app. My thumbprint, a second of verification, and then the screen loaded. Checking account, $0. Savings account, $0. The numbers were stark, absolute. 15 years of budgeting, of saving, of building a life together, erased with a single legal filing. The money I'd set aside for Chloe's ballet lessons, the deposit for the kids, summer camp, the emergency fund I so carefully maintained, all gone. He hadn't just declared war, he had already bombed my supply lines. I looked up from the phone, my breath catching in my throat. He was no longer just my husband. He was a stranger wearing Mark's face, a predator who had lived in my home, slept in my bed, and patiently waited for the perfect moment to strike. The secret law school education wasn't just a tool he would use in a courtroom. He had used it to lay this perfect, inescapable trap. I was in my own home, with no money, no access to help, and the man who held the keys to my entire life was explaining coolly, "You'll be allowed a small, court-approved stipend, of course, for groceries. But you won't be able to hire a lawyer, Sarah. You can't afford one. And by the time you find one who'll take your case pro bono, it'll be too late. The narrative will already be set." He turned to leave the room, pausing at the door. "I'll be sleeping in the guest room," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Try not to make a scene in front of the children in the morning." The door clicked shut, and the sound echoed in the sudden, crushing silence. I was trapped. Not just in a failing marriage, but in a legal cage he had spent 3 years meticulously building around me. There was no going back. There was no negotiation. He had taken my past and twisted it, stolen our present, and was now holding my future, and my children's, hostage. My name was Sarah, but in the eyes of the law, I was already the person he had invented, and I had $0 to my name to prove otherwise. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers, the folded legal papers, a toxic presence on the laundry pile, and listened to the sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards as Mark moved in the guest room, the soft breaths of my children sleeping down the hall. Each familiar sound was now laced with menace. By the time the sun began to bleed through the blinds, a desperate, half-formed plan had taken root in my exhaustion. The morning was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mark came into the kitchen dressed for work and acted as if nothing had happened. He poured himself coffee and asked Liam about his upcoming spelling test. He smiled at Chloe as she recounted a dream about a flying pony. I watched him, my hands shaking slightly as I buttered toast, my stomach a knot of acid. He was performing normalcy, and he was doing it for the children. It was a warning. I control this reality. Play along, or I will burn it all down. I played along. I kissed their foreheads, packed their lunches, and waved from the doorway as they ran to the bus, their laughter a painful echo of a life that was already gone. The moment the bus turned the corner, I grabbed my purse and car keys. My mind was screaming. He had stolen from us, from me and the kids. That had to be a crime. It didn't matter what legal papers he'd filed. You can't just take a family's entire life savings. The system had to protect against that. I drove to the local police precinct, my heart hammering against my ribs. The building was sterile, smelling of disinfectant and bureaucracy. I approached the front desk, where a uniformed officer with a tired, impassive face looked up from his computer. "I need to report a theft," I said, my voice thin. He gestured to a hard plastic chair. "Have a seat. What was stolen?" I took a breath, trying to organize the chaos in my head. "My husband. He's divorcing me. He drained all of our bank accounts. Everything. We have nothing. My kids and I have nothing." I held up my phone, ready to show him the zero balances, the proof of the crime. The officer's eyes glazed over the second I said, "Husband and divorce." He held up a hand, stopping me. "Ma'am, that's a civil matter." "But he took all the money," I insisted, my voice rising with panic. "He's left me with no way to live, no way to hire a lawyer to fight him. He's trapping me. Isn't that a crime?" "Is your name on the accounts?" he asked, his tone flat and bored. "Yes, they're joint accounts, but..." "Then it's not theft, ma'am. It's marital property. The courts will sort it out." He turned back to his screen, a clear dismissal. "But he's a lawyer," I blurted out, desperate for him to understand. "He went to law school in secret for 3 years, just so he could do this. He planned it all. He filed some kind of motion that let him do it. It's not right." The officer sighed, a long, put-upon sound. "Ma'am, if he filed a motion and a judge signed it, it's a court matter. What he learned in law school is irrelevant to us. We can't intervene in a judge's order. You need to get a lawyer." "I can't," I nearly shouted, feeling the last of my composure fray. "That's the point. He took all the money, so I can't afford one." He just stared at me, his expression a wall of indifference. "That's not a police matter," he repeated slowly, as if speaking to a child. "It's a domestic issue. You need to talk to a lawyer." I stood there for a moment, the uselessness of my position crashing down on me. He wasn't going to help. The system I had run to for protection was shrugging its shoulders, pointing me back toward the very cage Mark had built. I turned and walked out, the automatic door sliding shut behind me with a quiet hiss. The sun felt too bright, the world too loud. He had known this would happen. This was part of the plan, a step he had learned about in some dry, dusty textbook during his secret life. He hadn't just studied the law, he'd studied its weaknesses, its blind spots. He knew the police wouldn't touch a, quote, domestic issue, and that a judge's signature, even on a temporary order, was a shield he could hide behind. The system wasn't failing me. It was working exactly as he'd predicted, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I drove home in a daze, the officers bored, dismissive words echoing in my ears. Civil matter, domestic issue, get a lawyer. It was a neat, tidy loop of institutional indifference, a perfect circle designed to keep people like me out and people like Mark in control. He had counted on this. His time in law school hadn't just taught him what the law could do. It had taught him what it wouldn't do. He knew exactly where the system would draw its lines and had positioned me on the wrong side of every single one. I walked back into the house that no longer felt like mine. The silence was heavy, accusatory. I was a trespasser in my own life. I sank onto the sofa, the floral pattern I'd spent weeks choosing now seeming to mock me. What was I supposed to do? Call my parents? They were retired, on a fixed income. They couldn't bankroll a legal war against a man who had our entire nest egg. Call my friends? The shame was a physical weight. And what could they do besides offer sympathetic words that would turn to ash in my mouth? When Mark came home that evening, he didn't even bother with the pretense of normalcy. The kids were at a friend's house for a playdate and dinner, a small mercy I had arranged that morning with my last shred of foresight. He walked in and placed a cardboard box on the coffee table. His movements were calm, precise. He knew I'd gone to the police. I don't know how. Maybe he just anticipated it, the next logical move for a desperate person. But the smug certainty in his eyes told me everything. "I see you had an unproductive afternoon," he said, his voice flat. He started opening the box, pulling out small, white plastic squares and lengths of cable. I stared at the objects, my mind slow to connect the dots. "What is that?" "Documentation," he said, not looking at me as he unwrapped a camera the size of a sugar cube. "Given your escalating and erratic behavior, I have a duty to ensure the children's environment is safe. I'll be installing these in the common areas. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway upstairs." My breath hitched. Cameras. He was going to put cameras in my home, in our home. "You can't do that," I whispered, the words feeling flimsy and powerless. He finally looked up, and his eyes were devoid of any warmth. They were the eyes of a strategist. "I can, and I am. It's my house too, Sarah." And as the parent concerned for his children's welfare in the presence of an unstable mother, the court will see it as a prudent and necessary step. He held up the tiny camera between his thumb and forefinger. "This will provide an objective record of your conduct." For the judge. The full, horrifying scope of his plan slammed into me. This was the next phase. He had stripped me of my resources, isolated me from help, and now he was turning my home into a witness box. My sanctuary was now a soundstage for the character he was creating. Every sigh of exhaustion would be evidence of depression. Every sharp word to him would be proof of aggression. A glass of wine would be a relapse. He was baiting me, daring me to react, knowing that any authentic emotional response would be twisted and used as another nail in my coffin. This was what his late nights in the library had been for. This was the real curriculum of his law school education. It wasn't about justice, it was about strategy. It was about learning how to turn a home into a prison and a mother into a case file. He had studied the rules of the game so he could rig it from the inside. "You're sick," I said, the words barely audible. "I'm thorough," he corrected, standing up to survey the living room ceiling. "I'll start here. I want to make sure I get a good, wide angle of the whole room." He walked toward the corner, holding the little white square, and all I could do was sit there, frozen. He wasn't just my husband anymore. He wasn't just an attorney. He was my warden. And the battle for my children, for my life, wasn't going to be fought in a courtroom weeks or months from now. It was starting right here, right now, under the unblinking eye of a camera he held in his hand. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. I became an actress in my own home, every movement choreographed for an audience of one. The judge Mark was grooming. I smiled as I made pancakes, my lips feeling stiff and unnatural. I read bedtime stories to Liam and Chloe, my voice even and calm, while the tiny white camera mounted in the hallway stared at us, its single black eye a silent accuser. Mark had turned my life into a performance, and my children's happiness depended on me giving the performance of a lifetime. I played the part of the devoted, stable mother, all while a cold, calculated rage simmered just beneath the surface. He grew cocky. He'd leave his briefcase by the door, no longer bothering to lock it, confident that the cameras would deter me from looking. He'd work on his laptop at the dining room table in the evenings, occasionally glancing up to see if I was watching, a smug little smirk on his face. He believed he had me perfectly contained, a specimen in a jar. He was so focused on the legal framework he'd learned in law school, so sure of his strategy, that he forgot one crucial thing. He had taught me his habits for 15 years. I knew where he put his keys, how he organized his papers, and where he kept the things he considered most important. The window came on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the cameras went up. "I have an all-day deposition in the city tomorrow," he announced over dinner, not looking at me but at the children. "It's a big case. I won't be home until very late." My heart gave a single hard thud. An entire day, the kids would be at school. I would be alone in the house, under surveillance, but alone. It was the only chance I was going to get. The next morning, I waved goodbye to the school bus, the perfect picture of motherhood, then closed the front door. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the cameras. I knew they were watching as I washed the breakfast dishes, as I tidied the living room. Let them watch. The camera saw the room, but they couldn't see inside my head, and they couldn't see into his home office, the door of which he now kept locked. I went to the basement, my steps quiet on the wooden stairs. In a dusty box labeled Old House Keys, I found it, a small tarnished brass key for the old-fashioned locks on our interior doors. My hand trembled as I walked back upstairs and inserted it into the lock of his office door. It turned with a quiet click. The room was his new sanctuary, his war room. The family photos were gone, replaced by shelves of thick, imposing law books. His desk was neat, organized for battle. And there, sitting directly in the center, was a thick manila folder. It was closed, but I didn't need to see the label. I knew what it was. It was the, quote, comprehensive file, his entire case against me. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the culmination of his secret law school education, the physical manifestation of his 3-year plot. I reached out, my fingers tracing the edge of the folder. This was his playbook, his weapon. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I opened it. It was worse than I could have ever imagined. Page after page of my life, meticulously twisted. Receipts from the grocery store with the wine purchases circled in red. A printed-out calendar where my book club meetings were labeled suspected drinking binges. There were photos of me, asleep on the sofa, taken without my knowledge, captioned with notes about my depressive episodes. There was even a formal-looking report from a private investigator detailing my movements, including my desperate trip to the police station. He had been one step ahead of me the entire time. My hands shook as I flipped to the last section. It was a typed outline titled Closing Argument Strategy in the Custody of Liam and Chloe. I read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. He had woven every lie, every twisted half-truth, into a devastating narrative of a negligent, alcoholic, unstable woman from whom he, the heroic father, was rescuing his children. It was a masterpiece of deceit, built with the cold, hard tools he'd acquired in law school. I was staring at the blueprint for my own destruction. I was so absorbed in the horror of his words, so lost in the cold precision of his plan, that I didn't hear the car. It was the sound of the garage door rumbling open, a sound that wasn't supposed to happen for another 8 hours, that shattered the silence. My head snapped up. My blood turned to ice. He was home. I was trapped in his office, his entire vile strategy spread across the desk, my fingerprints all over the evidence of his betrayal. The door to the kitchen swung open, and I heard his footsteps on the hardwood floor. His footsteps weren't rushed. They were heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who knows he has won. The doorknob to the office began to turn. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I stood frozen, the manila folder open on the desk, my fingerprints a screaming confession on every twisted page. The door swung inward. Mark stood there, his suit jacket off, his tie loosened. He wasn't holding a briefcase, he was holding his car keys. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, instantly replaced by a cold, predatory rage as his eyes took in the scene. Me, his locked office, his master plan splayed open on the desk. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous thing. I couldn't speak. My throat was a knot of terror, my mind was a blank wall of panic. I was caught. It was over. "I knew it," he said, taking a step into the room, a cruel smile beginning to form. He looked from me to the folder. "I knew you couldn't help yourself. Spying, breaking and entering, this is perfect. Better than I could have hoped. The judge is going to love this." His gaze was locked on my face, savoring my fear, but my eyes were still on the last page of his outline, the one I'd been reading when the garage door opened. It wasn't the narrative about my instability that held me captive now. It was a separate, stapled addendum. A spreadsheet. It detailed the current value of the educational trust my parents had established for Liam and Chloe. Next to it was a column of projected legal fees, and then a final sickening calculation. He had outlined a legal strategy to petition the court, as sole custodian, to liquidate the trust to, quote, better manage the assets for the children's welfare, absorbing it into his own accounts. It wasn't just about custody. It was never just about the kids. The entire 3-year secret law school deception wasn't just to take my children. It was to steal from them. The shock was a physical jolt, a current of ice and fire that burned away my fear. The man I married, the father of my children, had not only planned to erase me from their lives, but to then systematically plunder their future, a future secured by their grandparents' love. This went beyond a custody battle. This was a heist. The cold, meticulous evil of it was breathtaking. His law school education wasn't a weapon for a fight. It was a crowbar to crack open a vault. "You're right," I said, my voice suddenly clear and steady. It startled him. He expected tears. I reached down, my hand no longer shaking, and picked up a single piece of paper, the spreadsheet detailing his plan to gut the trust fund. I folded it neatly and tucked it into the waistband of my jeans. "Give me that," he snapped, his smile vanishing. He took a step toward me. I didn't flinch. I held his gaze and walked past him, out of the office and into the hallway. I stopped directly beneath the small, white camera he had mounted on the ceiling. I turned to face him, positioning myself so the unblinking black lens had a perfect view of us both. He followed me out, his face contorted with fury. "What do you think you're doing? Give me that paper, Sarah." I looked up at the camera, then back at him. "This is what you wanted, isn't it, Mark? Documentation. An objective record." He froze, his eyes darting from me to the camera and back again. The gears were turning in his head, the lawyer assessing the new terrain. "It was never about my drinking, was it?" I asked, my voice ringing with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "It wasn't about a fender bender or my instability. That was all just noise, a story you built." I pulled the folded paper from my waistband and held it up between us. This is what it was always about, their trust fund. A flash of genuine surprise, then something worse, pride. He thought I was trying to blackmail him, to negotiate. He still thought he was in control. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he sneered, taking the bait. He was so arrogant, so high on his own brilliant scheme, he couldn't help but gloat. "But you're still too late. It's a perfectly legal strategy. As sole custodian of the children, I have a fiduciary duty to manage their assets. A judge will see it as prudent financial planning." "You call stealing from your own children financial planning?" I shot back, my voice rising, making sure the camera's microphone would pick up every word. "This is fraud, Mark. You spent 3 years in law school not to become a lawyer, but to become a more effective thief." His face darkened. "I'm their father. I'm securing their future. A future away from their alcoholic, unstable mother." He was shouting now, performing for the camera he thought he controlled, reciting the lines from his own script. "What I learned in law school gives me the right to protect them and their assets from you." "It's all right here, Mark," I said, holding up the spreadsheet. "The plan to liquidate their education fund? Is this you protecting them?" And then he made his fatal mistake. He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "That paper is inadmissible. You obtained it illegally. It proves nothing but your own desperation." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "But yes, of course, it's about the money. It was always about the money. I'm not going to spend the next 18 years paying for kids I'm raising by myself. The trust pays for everything. It's a clean, brilliant plan, and you just handed me the final piece of evidence I need to execute it." He lunged for the paper, but as his fingers brushed against mine, his eyes followed my gaze upward, to the small, white plastic square on the ceiling, to its single silent recording eye. The color drained from his face. The smug triumph, the arrogant pride, it all collapsed in an instant. He had just confessed to premeditated fraud and admitted his entire custody case was a sham, not to a judge, not to a lawyer, but to his own meticulously placed surveillance system. He had been so focused on the case he was building against me that he'd forgotten his own evidence could be used against him. His greatest weapon, the very tool born from his secret law school strategy, had just recorded his undoing. He stared at the camera, then at me, his mouth slightly agape. He was the smartest man in the room until suddenly he wasn't. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint electronic hum from the camera on the ceiling. He was trapped in its gaze, a fly in a web of his own making. The intricate, devastating narrative he had spent 3 years in law school perfecting had just been undone by a single arrogant monologue. Then the panic broke through his paralysis. "Delete it," he snarled. But the command was for himself, a frantic thought spoken aloud. His eyes darted around the room, not at me, but at the sources of his own downfall. The camera, the internet router in the corner. He took a clumsy, lunging step toward the wall, his hands outstretched to rip the wires from their sockets. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I took 2 steps back, my hand already closing around the phone in my pocket. His aggression was the final gift. He wasn't just a white-collar criminal. He was a man losing control, and the camera was recording that too. I pressed the call button, my thumb steady. 911. What is your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, a lifeline in the chaos. My husband is in my home, I said, my voice even, never taking my eyes off Mark as he fumbled with the router. He has just confessed on his own surveillance system to planning a felony. He is now attempting to destroy the evidence and is becoming increasingly agitated. I gave her our address clearly and precisely. Mark froze, the router in his hand. He turned to me, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. "You called the police?" he whispered, as if I had just broken the last sacred rule of a game only he was allowed to play. "You taught me to be thorough, Mark," I said, ending the call. The wait for the sirens was the longest 5 minutes of my life. He just stood there, staring at me, the gears of his legal mind grinding to a halt. He had no strategy for this. There was no textbook chapter for what to do when your victim uses your own weapon against you. When the doorbell rang, it was sharp and commanding. I walked past him to answer it. Standing on our doorstep were 2 officers, and my heart sank for a second. One of them was the same man from the precinct, the one with the bored, indifferent eyes. "Ma'am," he began, his voice already tired, "we got a call about a—" "He's in the hallway," I interrupted, stepping aside. "Officer, I was here earlier today. You told me my situation was a civil matter." The officer's expression hardened slightly, annoyed at being reminded. "And I'm sure it still is." "It's not," I said, my voice unwavering. "A few minutes ago, my husband Mark confessed on a camera that he installed. He confessed that his entire custody filing is a pretext to gain control of our children's trust fund, which he then intends to liquidate for his own use. He called it a clean, brilliant plan. He is a newly minted attorney, and this is conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence is being recorded to a cloud server as we speak." The officer's bored expression dissolved. He looked past me, at Mark, who stood pale and rigid in the hallway. He looked up at the small white camera. The word fraud had changed the entire equation. This wasn't a domestic squabble over marital assets anymore. This was a crime. "Sir," the officer said, his voice now devoid of any previous apathy, "please come over here." Mark didn't move, he just stared at me. "She's lying," he said, but his voice was hollow. "She broke into my office. She's unstable." "Is that your camera, sir?" the second officer asked, pointing. Mark's jaw tightened. "Yes, but—" "And is it recording?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't admit it was. And he couldn't lie because he knew I had the server login. All his training, all his meticulous planning from law school had led him to a dead end. He had built a perfect trap, and he was the only one in it I watched as they put him in handcuffs. The metallic click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the locks on my cage breaking. It was the sound of my children's future being handed back to them. It was the sound of justice. As they led him out the door, he looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled not with anger, but with the blank, utter shock of a master strategist who had been beaten at his own game. The moment the front door closed, the adrenaline fled my body in a single, gut-wrenching wave. My legs gave out, and I slid down the wall to the floor, the folded spreadsheet still clutched in my hand. The shaking started in my fingers and spread through my entire body. I was alone in the quiet house. The silence was no longer menacing. It was mine. I looked up at the little white camera, the silent witness to my husband's downfall. He had spent a fortune on his law school education, but the most important lesson was the one he had just taught me for free. The system can work, you just have to give it the right evidence. I stayed on the floor, the cold of the hardwood seeping through my jeans, until the shaking subsided into a low, steady tremor. My gaze remained fixed on the camera. My silent witness, my unwitting accomplice. It was still recording, uploading Mark's downfall to a server he had set up, a digital tomb for his meticulously crafted lies. The house was mine again, but it felt alien, contaminated. Every corner held a memory he had tried to poison. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. The folded spreadsheet was still a damp, crumpled thing in my fist. I walked into his office, my office now, and sat in his chair. The law book stared down at me from the shelves, a library of deceit. He hadn't used his law school education to uphold justice. He'd used it to learn how to pervert it. He'd studied the intricacies of the system not to work within it, but to find the cracks, the loopholes, the exact pressure points to make a person break. The very idea of law school now left a sick, metallic taste in my mouth. It was a place that had taken my husband and turned him into a monster. My first coherent thought was practical. Evidence. I logged into his laptop, my fingers flying over the keys. I found the cloud service for the cameras, changed the password to something he would never guess, Chloe's birth date and Liam's favorite dinosaur, and downloaded the entire recording from the hallway. The whole ugly confession, his rage, his attempt to destroy the router. I saved it to a thumb drive from the desk drawer, then emailed a copy to a new, anonymous account I created on the spot. I unplugged each of the cameras, leaving them in place like small, white monuments to his hubris. They were exhibits now, not tools of oppression. An hour later, a detective called. Her name was Diaz, and her voice was the opposite of the officer at the precinct. It was sharp, focused, and held no trace of condescension. "Mrs. Miller," she said, "we have your husband in custody. The DA's office is fast-tracking the review, but I've seen the video you gave the officers access to. His confession is unambiguous." I sank onto the sofa, the phone pressed hard against my ear. "So what happens now?" "We're holding him on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud, and the DA is adding a domestic charge based on his behavior at the end of the recording. A judge has issued an emergency protective order. He cannot come near you or the children. He can't contact you at all." "But Sarah," she paused and her voice softened slightly, "you need a lawyer, a good one. This is going to be a very, very ugly fight. His career is over before it even began, and he has nothing left to lose." A lawyer. The word sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I would have to find one, trust one. I would have to sit in an office surrounded by the same books that lined Mark's shelves and hand over the details of my life to someone who had been through the same training he had. I would have to believe that not everyone who went to law school came out broken, that some of them still believed in the things those books were supposed to represent. The thought was terrifying. The sound of the garage door opening made me jump. It was my friend Jessica dropping off the kids. I met them at the door, plastering a smile on my face that felt like a cheap mask. "Mommy!" Chloe yelled, running to hug my legs. Liam was right behind her, holding up a drawing of a lopsided spaceship. "Hey, sweethearts," I said, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't show. I hugged them tightly, burying my face in their hair, breathing in the scent of them, of innocence. "Where's Daddy?" Liam asked, looking past me into the empty house. I knelt down, meeting their eyes. The lie I had to tell was the most painful part of the entire day. "Daddy had to go on a work trip," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. "It was very sudden. He'll be gone for a little while." Later that night, long after they were asleep, I walked through the quiet house. I saw him everywhere. I saw him at the dining table, smirking behind his laptop. I saw him standing in the doorway of our bedroom, pronouncing my life sentence. The trauma was a phantom limb, an ache where he used to be. I fell into bed, exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face when he lunged for the paper, the moment the brilliant lawyer realized he was just another common criminal. I saw the flashing lights painting the walls of our living room. It wasn't a nightmare, it was just my life now. The battle was over, but the war had left me a soldier, stranded on an unfamiliar shore, with no map and the sound of explosions still ringing in my ears. The first lawyer I called, a woman named Ellen Richards, recommended by Jessica's cousin, had an office that smelled of lemon polish and old paper, just like Mark's had. For a moment, sitting in the leather chair across from her desk, surrounded by the same thick, intimidating legal volumes, my throat threatened to close. I felt like a child playing dress-up in a world I didn't belong in. But Ellen wasn't Mark. She listened, her expression sharp and focused, as I laid out the whole story. I didn't cry. I spoke with the cold precision of a witness, detailing the secret law school education, the cameras, the spreadsheet, the confession. I slid the thumb drive across her polished desk. He weaponized his law school degree against me. I finished. He knew every loophole. He knew who would help him and who would turn me away. "The police," she said, nodding. "It wasn't a question. They told you it was a civil matter." The first officer did. I confirmed, the memory of his bored, indifferent face making my jaw tighten. He dismissed me completely. Ellen leaned back in her chair, her eyes holding mine. "What he did was lay a textbook coercive control trap, Sarah. The financial seizure is step 1. Isolating you from legal and institutional support is step 2. He knew the police at the front desk are trained to see marital disputes, not felonies in disguise. You didn't just get lucky with that video, you outplayed him at his own game. Now we use it." Leaving her office, I felt a fragile sense of hope, but the injustice of that first police encounter was a piece of grit I couldn't wash away. Mark had counted on that officer. He had built his plan on the foundation of that man's apathy. It wasn't enough that Mark was in jail. The system that had enabled him, even for a day, had to answer for it. The next morning, I drove back to the precinct. I didn't feel the panic or desperation of my first visit. I felt a cold, hard sense of purpose. I walked through the same automatic doors, smelled the same disinfectant, and saw him. The same officer, sitting at the same desk, staring at the same computer screen. I walked straight to him. He looked up, a flicker of recognition in his tired eyes, quickly followed by annoyance. "Ma'am, if this is about your domestic—" "I'd like your name and badge number," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the low hum of the room. He blinked, taken aback. "Why?" "Because when I tried to report a felony a few days ago, you told me it was a civil matter and sent me away," I said, my voice level. "You told me it wasn't theft when my husband, an attorney, used a fraudulent emergency motion to steal my family's entire life savings. You told me it wasn't a police matter when I told you he was trapping me, leaving me with no resources to fight for my children." A few people in the waiting area looked over. The officer's face flushed. "Ma'am, that's a mischaracterization. I advised you to seek legal counsel." "You dismissed me," I stated, leaning forward slightly. "You didn't listen. You heard husband and divorce, and you shut down. You know what he did after I left here? He came home and installed surveillance cameras to build his fraudulent case against me. He confessed on those cameras. He confessed to planning to steal my children's education trust after he'd taken them from me, a plan he learned how to execute during the 3 years he was in law school. Your dismissal almost cost me my children. It almost made me another statistic." I saw his supervisor, a woman with captain's bars on her collar, approaching from a back office. She'd clearly overheard. The officer stood up. "Ma'am, I was following procedure for a domestic dispute." "No," I said, looking past him to the captain. He was following a bias. He saw a distraught woman, not a victim of a calculated crime. "Your officer was a predictable weakness in the system, and my husband, the lawyer, knew exactly how to exploit it. I have a case number now. I have Detective Diaz. I have video evidence of a felony confession. What I don't have is any confidence that the next woman who walks through that door, in the exact same position I was, won't be met with the same dangerous indifference." The captain looked at the officer, then back at me. Her expression was grim. "Ma'am, I am Captain Ava Rostova. Please come with me." I followed her to her office, leaving the officer standing red-faced at his desk. I spent the next hour with her and Detective Diaz, who had arrived after a call from the captain. I played them the audio from my phone of my first encounter, which I had recorded without even thinking. I explained how Mark's law school knowledge wasn't just about the courtroom. It was about knowing how the system's gatekeepers, like that front desk officer, would react. "He was right," I finished, my voice raw. "He predicted every move, and your officer was his first pawn." Captain Rostova was silent for a long moment. "Your husband is a predator of a different kind," she said finally. "And you're right. Our intake protocols for domestic calls failed you. It's a training issue, a systemic one." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a weary professionalism. "Would you be willing to help us fix it?" She explained her idea, a new training module for all patrol and desk officers on identifying coercive control and sophisticated financial abuse in domestic situations. They wanted me to help design it. They wanted me to record a video telling my story to be shown to every new recruit, to put a face to the kind of sophisticated manipulation that doesn't leave bruises. I walked out of the precinct that day, not with an apology, but with a purpose. Mark had used his education to try and destroy me. I would use mine to make sure he could never do it to anyone else. 3 months later, the house smelled not of stale coffee and betrayal, but of fresh paint and lavender. The silence that greeted me after the school bus pulled away was no longer a threat, but a peaceful expanse of time that belonged only to me. A court-issued protective order kept Mark 100 yards away, a legal barrier far more effective than any deadbolt. His criminal trial for fraud was pending, a slow-moving storm on the horizon, while our divorce and custody case, managed by Ellen's sharp and relentless guidance, was a foregone conclusion. The video had been his undoing, but it was also my liberation. My therapist, a kind woman with gentle eyes, said healing required reclaiming the spaces he had contaminated, so I started with his war room, the office. One Saturday, while the kids were at my parents' house, I began the exorcism. I pulled every one of his thick, pompous law books from the shelves. Each one felt unnaturally heavy, weighted with the arrogance of the man who had used them not to build, but to demolish. I didn't donate them. I packed them into cardboard boxes, sealed them with packing tape, and stacked them in the corner of the garage like coffins. His law school education, all his meticulous research into the art of cruelty, was now just a pile of junk waiting for disposal. I painted the walls a soft, warm white. I bought a comfortable armchair and a small, second-hand desk for myself. The room where he had plotted my destruction was now where I paid my bills, wrote in a journal, and helped Liam with his reading. It was where Chloe and I would sit and draw, the floor littered with colored pencils and her wild, imaginative creations. One afternoon, she looked up at me from her drawing of a purple unicorn and said, "It's nice in here now, Mommy. It's not so dark." The true test, however, came on a Tuesday morning when I drove back to the precinct. I wasn't a victim begging for help. I was an invited consultant. Captain Rostova met me at the door and led me to a small conference room where a camera was set up on a tripod. It was a professional-grade camera, large and imposing, yet it held none of the menace of the tiny white cube that had once watched me from my own hallway. This camera was not a weapon, it was a microphone. "Ready?" the technician asked. I took a breath and nodded, my hands resting on the table in front of me. I looked into the lens, imagining the faces of hundreds of new officers. fresh from their own training, their own academy. "My name is Sarah Miller," I began, my voice clear and steady. "A few months ago, my husband tried to take my children from me. He didn't use fists, he used the law. He had just secretly completed 3 years of law school, and he used that knowledge not to seek justice, but to manipulate the system he knew was sworn to provide it. I told them everything. I explained how he'd manufactured a narrative of instability, how he'd seized our assets knowing the police would call it a, quote, civil matter. I described the chilling moment I realized his law school education was just a tool set for a more sophisticated kind of abuse. He knew that a patrol officer on a busy day is looking for bruises, for broken furniture, for signs of a physical fight, I said, leaning forward. He counted on you being too busy to look for the quiet violence of a drained bank account, of legal papers filed with malicious intent. He weaponized your procedures against me. His plan almost worked. Don't let it work on the next person who comes to you for help. Look deeper. Listen harder. The most dangerous predators are the ones who know your rule book better than you do." When I finished, the room was silent. I had taken the ugliest part of my life, the part born from his deception and the cold letters of his law school textbooks, and turned it into a lesson. Mark had studied to learn the system's weaknesses. I was now here to help strengthen them. The camera stopped recording, but I kept looking into its dark lens, no longer an actress in a nightmare, but the author of its epilogue. A year has passed. The house is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's the peace of a Sunday afternoon, not the charged silence of a prison. I'm sitting in what used to be Mark's office, the walls now a warm, buttery yellow. Chloe is on the floor, meticulously coloring a family of dragons, and Liam is at the small desk beside me, sounding out words from a chapter book. The heavy law books are long gone, replaced by shelves of children's stories, novels with cracked spines, and on the top shelf, a few textbooks of my own. Mark's criminal trial was mercifully brief. The video of his confession, captured by his own camera, was the only witness the prosecution needed. He was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud and disbarred before he ever had a single client. The man who had spent 3 years in law school learning how to manipulate the system was now a ward of it. Our divorce was finalized 6 months ago. Ellen handled everything. I never had to see him again. The temporary order became permanent. I have sole custody. He has no contact. The end was a series of signatures on paper, a quiet, legal dismantling of the life he tried to blow up. The training video I made with Captain Rostova led to something I never expected. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, and I found that my story, the specifics of Mark's calculated abuse, resonated with so many others. They were women terrorized, not by fists, but by motions, filings, and the weaponized language of the court. The dread I once felt about Mark's secret education began to transform. I realized knowledge was the only antidote to the poison he'd used. Last fall, I enrolled in a paralegal studies program at the community college. Sitting in my first class, Introduction to Family Law, I expected to feel the ghost of his betrayal. I expected to feel sick. Instead, I felt a surge of power. As the professor explained the nuances of custody filings and asset division, I wasn't hearing the tools of my destruction. I was learning the language of my own defense, and now, the defense of others. Mark's law school education was a secret, selfish endeavor meant to give him power over me. Mine is the opposite. It's public. It's for my children. It's for the woman who will walk into that shelter tomorrow, holding a sheaf of confusing papers, terrified and alone. I'm learning how to build shields, not forge weapons. Sometimes, late at night, I think of him. I think of the cold arrogance in his eyes as he explained his brilliant plan, so sure of his victory. He believed his law school degree made him invincible. He never understood that true strength isn't found in a textbook or a courtroom strategy. It's forged in the moments you read a bedtime story to a child who feels safe in your arms. It's built in the quiet resilience of a life you refuse to let be destroyed. He thought his education would be the end of my story, the final word. He never imagined it would become the preface to mine. I've learned that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define the rest of our lives, unless we let them. They can be a full stop, or they can be a turning point. Thank you for following my journey from the beginning. If my story has meant something to you, and you want to see what happens next, please like and subscribe. I'm just getting started.